Earlier this year, financial services firm PwC wrote to Revenue Minister David Parker complaining about the process the government followed on big tax legislation. The National Party got a copy of the letter under the Official Information Act, and I'm joined by National's revenue spokesperson, Andrew Bailey. So what are the main concerns of PwC?
Well, it's interesting that a big firm like PwC has officially written not only to the Minister but to the Finance and Expenditure Committee outlining their concerns about the process for the development of new tax bills. Their principal concerns are that for some reason this government's chosen to do a lot of changes by way of supplementary order paper, or what's commonly referred to as SOPs.
Which just explain. Yeah, so that means
that means that a piece of legislation is entered into the House, it goes to the Select Committee, then it comes back into the House for discussion. That is the point where a minister often puts up these SOPs, which radically, in some cases, changes some new provisions in the bill, introduces a whole lot of new stuff into the bill, which obviously means it hasn't been discussed during the Select Committee stage, where we hear from everyone wanting to talk about those bills. So what it means is we're developing tax policy and tax legislation that hasn't been subject to the full exposure of Select Committee process where people can make submissions.
And reading the letter, they also seem to be saying, just in general, the government's trying to do too much too quickly and that officials are being rushed.
Yeah, well, certainly every year, on average, we do 3 pieces of tax legislation. So we obviously do annual rates and then we do 2 other substantial bills. That's the norm. But increasingly, there's been quite significant changes put through by this government. But what they're saying is twofold. One is the complexity of what's been put through needs more time, because as a large company like PwC, and we've got other large accounting firms, by way of example, they're having to devote huge amount of resources covering these omnibus bills, which cover a vast range of matters rather than being quite small and targeted. So they're having to deploy a lot of resources to actually make meaningful submissions, and in many cases they only get 15, 20 minutes in the Select Committee, so they can't traverse all the issues in their bill. So large parts of the bill go missing and not subject to any scrutiny or public intervention. And the other thing they're saying is that the level of consultation in preparing the bills is not adequate. There's selective consultation rather than using a proper process to work up these bills that ultimately become acts over time.
And they're actually, talking about one specific bill in this letter, although they say it covers a range of bills. This is not just a unique situation. That particularly related to the residential property taxation changes.
Yeah, so the bill was just reconfirming the tax rates. So that's the annual tax bill, and it was described as that plus remedial matters bill. So it went all through the Select Committee, and then at the Committee of the Whole stage in the House, after we'd been through the Select Committee, the Minister came along and slapped down a great big pack of SOPs, which basically talked about residential property tax changes. Now, obviously, that wasn't subject to a whole lot of scrutiny, and certainly not by technical people like PwC and the KPMGs that we need to have looking at these pieces of legislation. Because what PwC are also identifying in their letter is that there's an increasing number of mistakes that have to be picked up through remedial matters. That's part of the bill that we were talking about. And so we're continuously fixing up old mistakes.
But they're also saying that they are finding it difficult to follow and understand the legislation, which, given the size of those firms, presumably it's even tougher for those smaller accountancy firms.
Well, that's right. And so the level of engagement we have with those people, and particularly if you're sitting on the Select Committee, you want to hear from your PwCs, your KPMGs, Deloittes, and you want to hear meaningful contributions from them, but they're saying, look, how much resourcing we've got, we can't devote all of it to just following what the government wants to do, but also the level and the extent of their contribution on the bills is limited by the Select Committee process. So the real solution to this is that we should be slower in doing these tax bills. There should be wider consultation, And in fact, they talk about general tax policy principles, which is a smart way of saying, let's consult and talk, particularly with the technical experts first, before you bring in these changes, and give them time to see and talk about them.
But as you say, a large part of these bills, right, are an annual thing, just setting the rates as they are. Wouldn't it be better for governments of whatever stripe to just do that for that legislation, and for that extra stuff that they might want to do that they would bring in through SOPs, that they put up a separate piece of tax legislation for?
Well, the trouble is it takes so long to put through tax bills through the House. So what increasingly, because the government's been so keen on bringing about a lot of changes in the tax policies, and that's, of course, their decision. But what it meant is these bills that traditionally were that wide are now that wide. They're covering, fringe benefit tax right through to you now can't deduct interest on a home. So they become very wide-ranging bills, and that's why these professional advisors are saying to us, look, we can't cover the breadth of this. We don't have the resources, and we certainly don't have the time during the select committee process to actually provide meaningful input. And so that's what I was saying before. The solution is be clear about what you're trying to do with the tax bills, and try not to do too much in them, and make sure you get broad agreement. You're not going to get unanimous agreement, but broad agreement with technical experts before you introduce the bills, so you get fewer changes that need to be made and increasingly need to be made. And we've seen it over the last few years. We were just going back, changing bills because there's been loopholes that have been identified or just poor drafting errors.
Andrew Bailey, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.